Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. By popular demand, I am in Hammersmith today. I'm just going to be focusing on the riverside inns, the more famous hostelries in this part of London. So if there are any particular gems that I have missed by just sticking to the river on this outing, then let me know down in the comments and maybe I'll come back another day. Pub number one, the Dove. Cheers from the Dove in their famously world record holding or UK record holding smallest bar room. Brought along my tape measure. What do we have? From the bar to the window over there, and make that about 125 centimetres, and in this direction something like 230. There is a hint on the What Pub site about the possible reason for this tiny bar room here at the Dove, and it comes from beer writer Martin Cornell. And he, in turn, is quoting from George Izzard's memoirs of his time running the pub from 1931 to 1965. He says it probably dates to his predecessors, Mr. and Mrs. Mays, who had the pub for 20 years prior to him. They arrived in 1911, which was hot on the heels of the 1910 Licensing Consolidation Act. One of the provisions of that is that in order to qualify for a full license that allows you to sell beer, wines and spirits rather than just beer, you'd need to have two distinct bar rooms, as was the norm at the time, a saloon bar and a public bar. And so the story goes, they made an emergency overnight fitting of this tiny bar room using a local boat builders to provide the woodwork for it, and managed to get a full license. As a result, upgrading from what was previously a beer-only license. The slight kink in that, as Martin Cornell writes, is that the licensing records show that the Dove always had a full license. So it may be that there was a misunderstanding there. Perhaps they believed that they needed this in order to continue to maintain their current full license. I don't know, but it's a nice story. It's a listed building. Historic England write that it's early to mid 18th century. They note that the windows are shuttered, and quite an unusual feature for a pub, and the main entrance is via this alleyway at the back. But it does, of course, also have this river frontage. It's one of the famous spots along the river here for watching the Oxford and Cambridge boat race, and it has this very nice balcony, 2 layers of balcony in fact, overlooking the river. The pub is on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. We shouldn't forget about that other front bar room, which would have been the saloon bar for a while, and that has some nice woodwork around it and quite possibly some 18th century elements. And that brick fireplace, according to CAMRA's pub heritage site, was a post-war addition around about 1948. There is a rear room given over to dining today. That's probably more modern, and then beyond that there is this outdoor balcony space. So let's take a look at the Dove's history. Some sources cite that it was originally a coffee house called possibly the Dove's Coffee House, and originated in 1740 before eventually turning into a pub proper sometime towards the end of that century. A newspaper article I found, this one dates to 1778, and it doesn't actually mention the pub specifically, but it does talk about doves in the context of dove cots and a local man who attempted to relocate his dilapidated dove cot. I particularly like this for the talk of pigeons walking around in a very melancholy manner. How would you tell? But I think that article is possibly giving some hints as to the origin of the name of this pub, the Dove. The earliest clear written record that I could find was from 1781. It's a passing mention in the usual Sun Fire Office insurance records. The earliest newspaper mention I could find which clearly mentions the pub, or as it was then, the coffee house, is from 1805. In 1813, a publication titled An Historical and Topographical Account of Fulham, including the hamlet of Hammersmith, writes that the poet James Thomson, who lived from 1700 to 1748, here wrote part of Winter, the first part of The Seasons. A little later on, an article I quite enjoyed from the Fashionable World section of the Morning Post in 1827 recounts how Prince Augustus Frederick, the Duke of Sussex, had a house next door to the Dove that he used for smoking. In 1852, the landlord at the time was fined for refusing to billet soldiers. Seems like he was a bit of a rebel, actually. There is a mention towards the end of that article that although the defendant paid the fine, he at the same time made some offensive remark relative to the government. William Morris lived next door at a house that he named Kelmscott House from 1878 to 1896. It is a Fuller's pub today. I had, of course, a half of good old London pride. Pub number 2, the Black Lion. It is a listed building. Historic England believe it to be late 18th century, but much altered. And they also mention that the interior is modernised. Camera's What Pub site doesn't really talk much about the building or its interior, but they do note that the large beer garden can seat 200 people. And possibly one of the most notable things about the exterior is the huge chestnut tree, apparently 400 years old. So the interior is somewhat modernised, but there are some interesting paintings and so forth dotted about. In particular, in one corner there is a painting of Sir Alan Herbert, and that corner table there was his favourite place to sit. So let's look at the history of the Black Lion on John Rock's map of 1746. Although there is no text to definitively identify this as the Black Lion, there is the outline of a building at roughly the right location, and tantalisingly there is a tree depicted immediately behind it. Could this be our chestnut tree? It's worth noting that the street that the Black Lion is on is called Black Lion Lane, and that usually indicates that the pub is of a significant age. Similarly, Black Lion Stairs, the access to the river at the bottom of Black Lion Lane, of course also takes its name from the pub, and a 1751 court record may mention Black Lion Stairs in Hammersmith. As is often the case, the earliest written record that I could find that seemed to clearly identify this pub at this location was a Sun Fire Office insurance record dating to 1790. There is a ghost story associated with this pub. Normally I would brush over these as sort of fanciful pub nonsense, but I think in this particular case it is quite interesting because it set an interesting legal precedent. This happened in 1804. It's referred to as the Hammersmith ghost murder case. A man was shot in an unfortunate case of mistaken identity. He was believed to be a ghost. The inquest was held at the Black Lion pub. It's actually quite a tragic story. One man shot dead, another man convicted of murder, and it was all caused by a prank by a local shoemaker who had decided to regularly dress up as a ghost and scare the locals. The debate about whether a mistaken belief is an allowable defence against a criminal charge rumbled on for practically 2 centuries, and this ghost murder episode was referred to as a precedent in a case at the Court of Appeal as recently as 1984. You can see the location of the pub marked with a PH on that mid-1800s Ordnance Survey map, and Black Lion Lane is also marked there. Similarly, in the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, and the stairs are also clearly drawn at that time. In 1915, Sir Alan Herbert took up residence nearby at 12 Hammersmith Terrace. There is a plaque there today. And this, the Black Lion, was apparently his local pub. He has that dedicated table in the corner. He wrote the novel Holy Deadlock, which satirised the divorce laws of the day, and then a few years later, as an MP, was responsible for the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1937. So we have AP Herbert to thank for a much more rational version of divorce law. So apologies if the interior footage at the Black Lion was a little bit thin on the ground, but I bumped into Clark from the channel who watches some of these videos, and instead we had a really nice chat and a pint. Pub number 3, the Old Ship. Cheers from the Old Ship. This is a half of something from Young's. Is it London Special? Is it called London something? I forget. I'm not sure there is a huge amount to say here about the exterior or the interior. There is this large veranda projecting out from the front, largely brick, whitewashed, and there's some ironwork around the veranda. Inside, it has a reasonably modern feel to it, with some nautical fittings, which is very much a running theme for these pubs along the riverside here in Hammersmith. There are some claims to this pub being 400 years old. That's obviously going to be quite hard to verify. The earliest record that is a reasonably good match that I could find for this pub was from 1791, the usual Sun Fire Office insurance records. There is a possible mention, slightly more credible, in the newspapers at 1831, at which time it wasn't apparently yet old. It was just referred to as the ship. Prizes were being presented for the Peter Boat sailing match. Peter boats were common Thames fishing craft in the 19th century, and they had a combination of a watertight compartment, but also part of the hull would be flooded so that the catch could be kept in water until it was brought back to shore. There is a later newspaper mention in 1844, which, assuming this is talking about the same pub, by this time it was referred to as the Old Ship. At least one source says that it was rebuilt in its current form in around 1850. You can see it marked on that mid-1800s Ordnance Survey map. The date ranges for that are somewhat vague, 1840s to 1860s. Around 1856, the landlord was, or just previously had been, Thomas Cole, who filed for bankruptcy, and he was previously the champion of the Thames, and that was effectively the champion of England for rowing. You can see the pub marked with a PH on that 1890s Ordnance Survey map, and then later on the mid-1900s, again vaguely 1940s to 1960s Ordnance Survey map. In 1914, the pub was threatened with having its licence removed, and it seemed to only prevail as a result of the case made for all the other services that the pub provided at that time, as a boating centre and a de facto life-saving station. Such was the fever for removing licences in the wake of that Licensing Consolidation Act of 1910. Fortunately, they did have a lucky escape here. However, not all pubs were as lucky. To illustrate, the same committee that sat and agreed to preserve the licence here at the Old Ship expunged the licence of the Chaise and Horses, despite its claims to having first been licensed in 1440, simply because it wasn't recently selling enough beer. Grim times for pubs. Pub number 4, the Rutland Arms. Cheers from the Rutland Arms. It's a Green King pub, and this is their house bitter, but I don't think it's the normal Green King pub house bitter, which is always the same beer, because the ABV was different. It was 4 point something rather than the usual 3 point something, so who knows. So let's talk about the exterior quickly at the Rutland Arms. It is a corner pub. Today, 2 stories, we'll come back to that later. It's predominantly built of, I think, London stock brick in Flemish bond. There seems to be a subtle banding at every 5th level in that brickwork. There are slightly darker toned bricks every 5th row. Brick tile arches over the windows, and they have stuccoed keystones. There's some stucco decoration in the capitals of the brick pillars in between those arches. Ironwork on the balcony around the 1st floor, and it's usually festooned with hanging baskets. Perhaps we're not seeing it at its absolute best. The interior, I suspect, is post-war at best, and we'll again come back to why that is a little bit later on, and quite possibly much of it is much more modern than that. The bar counter is quite woody. It has fielded panelling punctuated by carved fluted pillars. The bar back, again, at least conceptually, is traditional in style. Again, fluted pillars breaking up the shelving units, and along the top there are the names of some of the different drink offerings, whiskey, etc. A couple of fireplaces, maybe some part of those maybe slightly older, and some stained glass windows. I'm fairly sure they're more modern. The earliest maps that I could find that cover this area are these mid-1800s Ordnance Survey maps, and it looks to me, based on the outlines of the buildings present at that time, that it hadn't been built at that stage. It was probably first established in 1849, according to several sources. This area has been well documented in photographs thanks to its long-running associations with the boat race. You can clearly see the Rutland Arms, or the Rutland Hotel as it was known then, in this roughly 1860 photo that comes from the Hear the Boat Sing website, which has a fascinating history of the boating past of this area. Later on in the 1880s, you can again see the Rutland Hotel with a grandstand on top for spectators of the boat race. I found a newspaper mention of 1895 of the World's Championship, and I assume that is the same competition that was originally just known as the Champion of the Thames, or later effectively the Champion of England, and it seems like there has been a bit of grade inflation there. You can see the Rutland Hotel once again in the 1920s photo, another one from the the Boatsing website, and then later in that mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map you can see the pub clearly marked with the name Rutland Hotel. Several sources mention that the pub was quite badly damaged during World War II by bombing and consequently lost its upper floors. I think it's probably at that time that the pub changed from being called the Rutland Hotel to being called the Rutland Arms, and that makes sense if you imagine that the accommodation for the hotel was likely on those upper floors. The current sign on the wall of the pub shows the coat of arms of the county of Rutland, granted to the county in 1950. The motto Multum in Parvo, much in little, refers to Rutland being the smallest county in England. The earliest newspaper mention I could find of this pub as the Rutland Arms was in 1954, but it was still referred to as the Rutland Hotel up until 1945 at least. Pub number 5, the Blue Anchor. Cheers from the Blue Anchor. They did have landlord on the hand pumps. It was currently off, so I've gone for a half of Guinness instead. The other two things sounded a bit too IPA veering to my taste. So the exterior of the Blue Anchor, it has a sort of wharf building, boathousey sort of feel to it, to me, and I suspect it was built at the same time as the neighbouring building, which is now the Oriel Kensington Rowing Clubhouse, given that there is an adjoining balcony and the style of the windows and everything is quite similar. That boathouse next door was originally Biffin's Boathouse, and that was apparently built in 1869. So the exterior as we see it today, on the ground floor it is white and stucco fronted, with the doors and the windows painted in blue. Currently there is a central bay window that's flanked by 2 doors, but originally that central window was another entrance. The first floor is whitewashed brick, and it has a blue balcony. Inside there is an assortment of rowing paraphernalia. I spoke to the chap that I assume was the manager or the landlord, and it looked to me as though a fitting along one side by the bar counter was the original bar back, and he confirmed that actually yes, originally the bar counter did used to be on the right hand side of the main bar room as you come in. There is also a set of now purely ornamental hand pumps in that bay window, and that again attests the fact that the bar counter was at a different position at some point. It's hard to imagine that was along the window because that was at some time also an entrance, but there definitely has been some movement, I think, is the key takeaway here. There is also an upstairs room to the pub, which is more like a dining area today, and that gives some quite impressive views over the river. I'm sure that's a very popular spot come boat race time. The pub itself claims a date of 1722. The earliest record I could find that mentioned a pub called the Blue Anchor in Hammersmith is from 1786. In the History and Antiquities of the Parish of Hammersmith, published in 1839, there is a record that in 1789 a sheep was roasted whole on the Thames facing the Blue Anchor public house, and it sounds as though the river was frozen over at that time. It does seem slightly bizarre to me that an entire sheep was roasted on the frozen Thames. Can you imagine the scene? Steve, the river's frozen over. Great. What are we going to do? Skating? Sledging? Ice sculptures? No, let's roast a sheep on it. The earliest newspaper mention I could find was from 1841, and at that time it was referred to as the Blue Anchor Beer Shop. So that suggests that per the 1830 Beer House Act, this pub at that time had a beer-only licence. It was mentioned again in the London Gazette of 1843, also listed as a beer shop. Those same photos that we were looking at earlier for the Rutland Arms also depict the Blue Anchor, so here's one in 1860. A few years after that, I found another newspaper mention at which time the pub was being put up for sale. Again, the pub was at the time referred to as a beer shop. It's a copyhold, and that was a sort of precursor to leasehold dating back to feudal times. No new copyhold arrangements were created after the 17th century, suggesting that this is a very old estate, or part of a very old estate. And it was part of the estate of Kent House built in 1762, which still stands today, and it's a few doors down from the pub. There's also those two adjoining cottages mentioned in that sale. In 1886, a man was arrested here for uttering. That's something I had to look up. That's an old-fashioned name for trying to pass off counterfeit currency. On that 1890s Ordnance Survey map, it's interesting that the pub is not marked, and I wonder if that's because it was at that time a beer house rather than a public house. And you'll note that the Rutland Arms, or the Rutland Hotel as it was known then a few doors down, does get marked as a PH for public house. However, the pub is marked with a PH at the time of that mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map. We can also see it again on a 1920s photo taken from the Hear the Boat Sing site. So that is it for today from Hammersmith. I have, as I said at the start of the video, just stuck to the more famous, perhaps, riverside inns in this part of London, but do let me know in the comments if you think there are some backstreet boozers in this part of London that are worth a visit, and I may consider coming back this way at some point in the future. But for now, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.